What if I told you that a simple knock on the door at 2 a.m. would lead a retired detective into the most bizarre case of his 40-year career? My name is Frank. I'm 68 years old, and after 4 decades of chasing down criminals, solving murders, and unraveling mysteries, I thought I'd seen everything. But sometimes, the most extraordinary cases find you when you least expect them. 3 months ago, I was living the quiet retirement life in my small ranch house in Cedar Falls, Iowa. My days consisted of morning coffee, crossword puzzles, and the occasional fishing trip with my old partner Jake. The most excitement I'd had in years was when Mrs. Henderson's cat got stuck in my oak tree. But on that cold October night, everything changed. I was deep in sleep when the knocking started. Not the polite tap, tap, tap of a neighbor asking for sugar, but the urgent, persistent hammering that every cop recognizes. Someone was in trouble. My detective instincts, dormant for 3 years, suddenly surged back to life. I grabbed my old service weapon from the bedside drawer and made my way to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman, maybe early 30s, with wild hair and clothes that looked like she'd been running through the woods. She was glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, clearly terrified. When I opened the door, she practically fell into my arms. "Please," she gasped, "you have to help me. They're after me, and I don't know who else to trust." Now, in my years on the force, I'd heard every sob story imaginable. But there was something in her eyes, a genuine terror that you can't fake. I brought her inside, gave her a glass of water, and tried to calm her down enough to get some coherent information. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was a data analyst for a tech company in Minneapolis. She'd been driving home from a conference in Des Moines when her car broke down about 5 miles from my house. That's when things got interesting. "I was waiting for the tow truck," she explained, her hands still shaking, "when this black SUV pulled up behind me. 3 men got out and they weren't there to help. They knew my name, Mr. Frank. They knew where I worked, where I lived, even my mother's maiden name. I've always been a skeptical man. In police work, you learn to question everything. But Sarah's story had details that rang true. She showed me photos on her phone of the men approaching her car, though the images were blurry due to the darkness. What caught my attention was her explanation of how she escaped. "I pretended to faint," she said, "and when one of them came close to check on me, I grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it in his eyes. Then I ran into the woods. I've been running for 2 hours trying to find help." The story was already strange enough, but then Sarah told me why she thought these men were after her. 2 weeks earlier, she'd been working late at her office, running data analysis for what she thought was a routine client project, but she'd accidentally accessed the wrong database and stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. "It was a list," she whispered, looking around my living room as if someone might be listening. "Names, addresses, social security numbers, bank account information. But these weren't just random people. They were all elderly, all with significant savings, and all had died within the past 6 months. My detective radar went into overdrive. This sounded like elder fraud, but on a massive scale. I'd worked plenty of financial crimes during my career, but nothing quite like this. Sarah continued her explanation, and with each detail, the case became more intriguing. She'd done some digging on her own, cross-referencing the names with obituaries and death certificates. What she found was disturbing. All of these people had died under circumstances that, while not immediately suspicious, shared common elements. They'd all made significant financial transfers in the weeks before their deaths. They'd all changed their wills recently, and they'd all been clients of the same financial advisory firm. Pinnacle Financial Solutions, she said, and I wrote the name down in my old notepad. They specialize in estate planning for seniors. The pieces were starting to come together, but I needed more information. I suggested we call the local police, but Sarah shook her head vigorously. "I tried that already," she said. "I called the Minneapolis police after I discovered the data. The officer who took my report said he'd look into it. But 3 days later, I got a call from someone claiming to be from Internal Affairs, asking me to come in for questioning. When I showed up, no one knew anything about it. This was getting more complex by the minute. If Sarah was right, we weren't just dealing with financial fraud. We were potentially looking at a systematic operation to murder elderly people for their money, and it might involve corrupt law enforcement. I made a decision that would change both our lives. Instead of calling the local police, I decided to investigate this myself. I knew I didn't have official authority anymore, but I had something more valuable: 40 years of experience and a network of contacts who trusted me. My first call was to my old partner Jake, who'd retired 2 years before me. Jake had always been the tech-savvy one on our team, and he'd kept up with digital forensics even in retirement. When I explained the situation, he was at my house within an hour. "This is either the biggest case of paranoid delusion I've ever seen," Jake said after listening to Sarah's story, "or we're looking at something that makes the Watergate scandal look like a parking ticket." We spent the next 3 days holed up in my house, using every investigative skill we'd learned over the decades. Sarah provided us with copies of the data she'd found, and Jake worked his magic to trace the digital footprints. What we discovered was far worse than we'd imagined. Pinnacle Financial Solutions wasn't just stealing from elderly clients. They were systematically identifying wealthy seniors with no close family members, gaining their trust through a network of seemingly legitimate financial advisors, and then slowly poisoning them with untraceable compounds while simultaneously draining their accounts. The operation was sophisticated beyond anything I'd seen in my career. They had doctors on their payroll who would falsify death certificates, funeral directors who would ensure quick cremations, and even corrupt cops who would intercept any suspicious reports. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd gotten greedy and expanded their operation too quickly, which led to the data breach that Sarah had stumbled upon. And now they were trying to clean up loose ends. By the 4th day, we had enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. But we also knew we couldn't trust local law enforcement. Jake had contacts in the FBI, specifically in the white-collar crime division. We arranged a meeting with Agent Maria Rodriguez, someone Jake had worked with on previous cases. The meeting was set for a small diner outside of Waterloo, about an hour's drive from my house. We were careful to take back roads and watch for surveillance, but apparently we weren't careful enough. As we sat in the diner, waiting for Agent Rodriguez, I noticed a familiar black SUV in the parking lot, the same type of vehicle Sarah had described from her encounter. My instincts screamed danger, but before I could react, 3 men in dark suits entered the diner. "Mr. Frank Thompson," the lead man said, approaching our table. "I'm Agent Wilson, FBI. We need to talk." Something was wrong. Real FBI agents don't introduce themselves like characters in a bad movie. I could see Jake's hand moving slowly toward his concealed weapon, and I prepared for the worst. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, standing up slowly. "We're waiting for Agent Rodriguez." "Agent Rodriguez won't be coming," Wilson said with a cold smile. "She's been reassigned. We're here to discuss your recent activities." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. These weren't FBI agents. They were the same people who'd been chasing Sarah. But how had they found us? The answer came when I noticed Sarah's phone lying on the table, and I realized we'd been tracked. What happened next was like something out of an action movie, except the adrenaline was real, and the stakes were life and death. Jake created a distraction by accidentally knocking over a pot of coffee, causing a commotion that allowed us to slip out the back exit. We made it to Jake's car and drove frantically toward the nearest police station, but not before I noticed something that changed everything. One of the fake agents had a tattoo on his wrist, a distinctive symbol that I recognized from my days working organized crime cases. These weren't just financial scammers. We'd stumbled into something much bigger, a criminal organization that had been operating under the radar for years, using elder fraud as just one of their revenue streams. The next 2 hours were a blur of high-speed chases, phone calls to trusted contacts, and narrow escapes. Finally, we made contact with the real Agent Rodriguez, who confirmed our worst fears. The corruption went deeper than we'd imagined, involving not just local law enforcement, but federal agents as well. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Remember how I mentioned that Sarah had thrown dirt in one of the attackers' eyes? Well, it turns out she'd also managed to scratch one of them with her keys, and she'd kept the biological evidence under her fingernails. Agent Rodriguez was able to use that DNA evidence to identify the attacker, which led to a series of arrests that unraveled the entire operation. Over the next 6 months, federal agents arrested more than 200 people involved in the scheme, including 15 law enforcement officers and 8 federal agents. The scope of the operation was staggering. They'd been targeting elderly victims across 12 states, stealing an estimated $50 million over a 3-year period. More tragically, they'd been responsible for the deaths of at least 30 innocent people. Sarah's accidental discovery had not only saved her own life, but had also prevented countless future victims from being targeted. The data she'd found was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. But the most shocking revelation came during the trial. The mastermind behind the operation was someone I'd worked with during my career, a federal prosecutor named David Martinez, who I'd considered a friend. He'd been using his position to protect the criminal network while simultaneously prosecuting their competitors. The betrayal hit me hard. In 40 years of police work, I'd seen corruption, but never from someone I'd trusted so completely. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the people I'd worked with. The trial lasted 8 months, and I testified for 3 full days. Sarah was the star witness, and her courage in coming forward despite the danger was inspiring. Jake's technical expertise in tracing the digital evidence was crucial in securing convictions. In the end, justice was served. Martinez received a life sentence, and most of the other major players got substantial prison terms. The families of the victims received compensation from the seized assets, though no amount of money could bring back their loved ones. But this case taught me something important about retirement and about life in general. Just because you step away from your career doesn't mean your skills and experience become irrelevant. Sometimes, the most important work of your life happens when you least expect it. Sarah has become like a daughter to me. She moved to Cedar Falls and started her own cybersecurity consulting firm, specializing in protecting elderly people from online fraud. Jake and I have become unofficial consultants for her business, using our decades of investigative experience to help identify and prevent similar schemes. The case also led to significant changes in how elder fraud is investigated and prosecuted. The FBI created a new task force specifically focused on protecting elderly victims, and Congress passed legislation requiring better oversight of financial advisory firms. Looking back, I realized that the knock on my door that night wasn't just a random event. It was a reminder that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the most unlikely people can make the biggest difference. Sarah's bravery in running through the woods to find help, Jake's willingness to come out of retirement to help a friend, and even my own decision to get involved instead of just calling the police. These weren't acts of professional duty. They were acts of human decency. The case also reinforced something I'd learned during my career, but had forgotten in retirement: the importance of trusting your instincts. When Sarah showed up at my door, every rational part of my brain told me to call the police and let them handle it. But my gut told me something different, and that instinct saved lives. Today, I'm back to my quiet retirement routine, but with a new purpose. I volunteer with the local senior center, teaching elderly residents about financial scams and how to protect themselves. I also work with law enforcement agencies, sharing my experience and helping train younger officers. The case of Pinnacle Financial Solutions will always be one of the most significant of my career, even though it happened after my career officially ended. It proved that experience and dedication don't have expiration dates, and that sometimes the most important mysteries are the ones that find you when you're least prepared to solve them. If there's one lesson I want people to take from this story, it's this: never underestimate the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Sarah was just a data analyst who stumbled upon information by accident. Jake was a retired cop who could have ignored my late-night phone call. I was a 68-year-old retiree who could have simply called 911 and gone back to bed. But together, we took down a criminal organization that had been operating with impunity for years. We saved lives, brought justice to victims, and made our communities safer. And it all started with a knock on the door at 2 a.m.